She was found sitting upright in her bed, fully dressed, makeup still on, a book open in her hands, a book she had already told her publisher she had finished weeks ago. The most powerful female journalist in America was dead at 52, and someone had staged the scene so carefully that the medical examiner almost missed what was really there. She had been about to expose something so dangerous that people in very high places needed her to stop. Who decided Dorothy Kilgallen had to go silent, and how far up did the order go? His name was Francis Albert Sinatra. Born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1915, a city that smelled of factories, river water, and desperation. His mother, Dolly, was a backstreet abortionist who ran illegal operations out of their home. His father, Marty, was a boxer who could barely keep the lights on. This was not a childhood. It was a survival course. Frank was an only child, and he almost didn't survive being born at all. The delivery was so brutal that the doctor used forceps, tearing the left side of his face, his ear, his neck. The damage was permanent. He carried those scars his entire life, hidden beneath carefully combed hair and a turned collar. His grandmother took one look at the damaged infant and assumed he was dead. She placed him under the cold kitchen tap and walked away. Dolly had to revive her own son herself. That violence followed Frank out of the womb and into the streets. Hoboken in the 1920s was carved up by gangs. The docks were controlled by men who answered to no judge and no law. Young Frank watched those men. He studied them. He understood something early that most people never learn, that real power has nothing to do with talent. Real power is about who you know, and what those people are willing to do for you. By the time Frank was a teenager, he was running errands for local mob-connected figures. Not because he had to, because he wanted to belong to something that couldn't be touched. That hunger never left him. By the early 1940s, Frank Sinatra was becoming something America had never seen before. Girls fainted at his concerts, literally collapsed in the aisles. He was selling out theaters, topping radio charts, and landing Hollywood contracts that made studio executives weep with excitement. For a skinny kid from Hoboken with a scarred neck and no formal training, it felt like the impossible had happened. Then the draft board came knocking. The United States was at war. Every young man in America was expected to serve. Frank was classified 4F, unfit for duty due to a perforated eardrum, but the press didn't believe it. They called him a coward. They called him un-American. Overnight, the man who made women faint became the man that men despised. The dream didn't disappear. It was publicly shredded. He rebuilt. Slowly, painfully, brilliantly. By the early 1950s, Frank had clawed his way back, winning an Academy Award for From Here to Eternity, signing with Capitol Records, releasing albums that critics called masterpieces. He was no longer just a teen idol. He was an artist, a serious, respected, untouchable artist. And that was exactly when he made the introduction that would define and destroy the rest of his life. Sam Giancana walked into Frank's orbit sometime around 1955. Giancana ran the Chicago Outfit, the most powerful criminal organization in the Midwest. He controlled judges, politicians, and police chiefs the way other men controlled their morning schedules. Frank didn't run. Frank pulled up a chair. What followed looked, from the outside, like the peak of everything. Frank formed the Rat Pack. He built an empire in Las Vegas, performing at the Sands Hotel, which was, not coincidentally, financed by mob money. He had the ear of John F. Kennedy, the most powerful man on earth. He was photographed with presidents, royalty, and Hollywood royalty alike. He looked invincible. He looked clean. But behind every sold-out show at the Sands, Giancana's men were counting the real money in the back rooms. Behind every Kennedy handshake, favors were being exchanged that no one was meant to survive knowing about. Frank wasn't just friends with the mob. He was the mob's most valuable front, and he knew exactly what that meant. J. Edgar Hoover knew everything. That was not an exaggeration. Hoover's FBI had been watching Frank Sinatra since 1944. By the 1960s, his file had grown to over 1,300 pages. Agents documented his phone calls, his meetings, his movements across state lines. They watched him walk into rooms with Sam Giancana. They photographed them together. They recorded conversations, and they did absolutely nothing. The file sat, growing thicker every year. Never acted upon. Hoover was not a passive man. He destroyed careers with far less evidence than this. He wiretapped Martin Luther King Jr. over suspicions alone. He kept secret files on sitting presidents and used them as leverage. So why did Frank Sinatra's file stay buried? What exactly did Hoover know, and what was he getting in return for his silence? There was another name that kept appearing in the margins of these reports. Johnny Rosselli, a Chicago outfit lieutenant who operated directly under Giancana and maintained deep, documented connections to the CIA. Rosselli was the man who allegedly brokered the CIA's attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, using mob infrastructure to do the government's dirtiest work. Frank knew Rosselli, socialized with him, performed in rooms where Rosselli was present. And Rosselli, like Giancana, would later end up dead before he could testify to the Senate. Was Frank Sinatra simply a man who liked dangerous company, or was he something far more useful to people who needed certain things handled quietly? Then came the Calneva incident. The Calneva Lodge sat directly on the Nevada-California border at Lake Tahoe. Frank owned it. It was glamorous, remote, and crucially, Sam Giancana was a known regular guest there, despite being on the Nevada Gaming Commission's list of banned individuals. The Nevada Gaming Commission investigated, witnesses were interviewed, documents were subpoenaed. Then the investigation quietly collapsed. Key witnesses suddenly remembered nothing. Documents went missing. The commission revoked Frank's gaming license, but pursued nothing further. No criminal charges, no federal referral, no explanation. Who made that investigation disappear, and what did it cost them to do it? The villain in this story does not have a single face. It is not just Sam Giancana. It is not just J. Edgar Hoover. It is not just the Nevada Gaming Commission looking the other way. The villain is the system that made Frank Sinatra untouchable, and the specific men who fed that system to protect their own survival. But there is one moment, one act so precise, so cold, so deliberately cruel that it exposes exactly how this world operated. In 1962, Robert F. Kennedy was Attorney General of the United States. He had made destroying organized crime the central mission of his career. His team had Giancana under serious federal pressure. They were building cases. They were getting close. And then Kennedy's own brother, President John F. Kennedy, personally intervened. Not to help the investigation, to kill it. JFK instructed his Justice Department to quietly shelve key prosecutorial threads connected to Giancana because Giancana had been useful. Because the CIA had used Giancana's network in the Castro assassination plots. Because pulling that thread meant the whole cloth unraveled. And Frank Sinatra was woven into that cloth so deeply that exposing Giancana meant exposing Frank, and exposing Frank meant exposing the President of the United States. So Robert Kennedy, the man who built his reputation on fighting the mob, was ordered by his own brother to stand down. Bobby obeyed, temporarily, but he never forgave it, and he never forgave Frank. In early 1962, President Kennedy was scheduled to stay at Frank's Palm Springs estate during a California visit. Frank spent months preparing. He built a helipad. He constructed additional guest cottages. He installed a special telephone switchboard to handle presidential communications. He told everyone who would listen. He was proud. He was untouchable. Then Bobby Kennedy personally called the Secret Service and told them the president would not be staying with Frank Sinatra. The reason given internally and documented in Secret Service records was that Frank's association with Giancana made the location a security risk. Frank was not told diplomatically. He was not given a quiet explanation. He found out when the motorcade drove past his estate without stopping. He stood on his own helipad and watched the presidential helicopters land at Bing Crosby's house instead. That moment broke something in Frank Sinatra that never healed. Not because he lost the visit, because he finally understood what he actually was to these men. He was useful. He was connected. He could raise money, open doors, deliver votes, and smooth over relationships between Washington and the Chicago outfit when the government needed organized crime to do its dirty work. But he would never be legitimate. He would never be clean enough to stand beside the men he had helped put in power. They had used every favor he delivered, every introduction he arranged, every room he filled with the right people. And when the cameras were pointed at the White House, Frank Sinatra did not exist. Here is where most people think the story ends. Frank was humiliated. Frank was used. Frank finally understood his place in the machinery. A sad ending for a complicated man, and a clean enough conclusion to satisfy most documentaries. But there is one more layer, and it changes everything. On the night of June 19, 1975, Sam Giancana was in the basement of his Oak Park home. He was cooking sausages, alone, Relaxed enough to be making a late dinner in his own kitchen, which means he trusted whoever was in that house with him completely. Someone shot him once behind the left ear, then 6 more times around the jaw and chin. That particular pattern, 1 shot to silence, 6 more to the face, was not random. In mob language, it was a message. It meant the victim had talked too much. Giancana was scheduled to testify before the church committee the very next morning. The Senate committee investigating CIA assassination plots, the same plots that connected Giancana, Rosselli, the Kennedy administration, and the shadows Frank Sinatra had moved through for 2 decades. He never made it to that chair. Federal investigators noted something in their reports that was never fully explained. Giancana's home had a sophisticated security system, the kind that required deliberate deactivation, not the kind that simply failed. Whoever entered that basement did not break in. They were let in, or they had a key. The FBI interviewed Frank Sinatra in the weeks following Giancana's murder. The interview transcript exists. It is partially declassified. Large sections remain blacked out to this day, but here is the layer that almost no one knows. Giancana, in the final months of his life, had been conducting secret meetings with a man named Robert Maheu. Robert Maheu was Howard Hughes's personal fixer, the man who managed Hughes's Las Vegas casino empire, negotiated with mob figures on Hughes's behalf, and maintained direct operational contact with the CIA going back to the early 1960s. Maheu was also, according to declassified CIA documents, one of the primary architects of the Castro assassination plots. What were Giancana and Maheu discussing in those final months? Maheu died in 2008. He took those conversations with him. But investigators who examined Maheu's personal papers after his death found something unexpected. A series of handwritten notes referencing meetings that included a third party, someone Maheu referred to only by the initial F. No document has ever confirmed who F was. No investigator has ever officially connected that initial to Frank Sinatra. But consider what we know. Frank had been Giancana's closest entertainment world contact for nearly 2 decades. Frank had performed at Hughes-owned properties in Las Vegas. Frank had personally introduced Giancana to members of the Kennedy Circle. Frank moved freely between worlds that were never supposed to touch each other. And Frank Sinatra, in the months following Giancana's murder, abruptly canceled every scheduled public appearance for 6 weeks. His publicist cited exhaustion. No medical records were ever produced. What exactly was Frank Sinatra doing during those 6 weeks? And who was he talking to? Here is what we can prove. Frank Sinatra maintained a documented, decades-long friendship with Sam Giancana, one of the most violent organized crime figures in American history. Federal investigators photographed them together, recorded their conversations, filed report after report connecting Frank to the inner circle of the Chicago outfit. That is not speculation. That is in the archives. Here is what we can almost prove. The Cal Neva investigation was shut down in a way that career Nevada Gaming Commission investigators described, privately, as unlike anything they had ever seen before. Witnesses recanted overnight. Documents vanished. The kind of institutional collapse that does not happen by accident. Someone with serious reach made that disappear. And the partial transcripts of Frank's FBI interview, conducted after Giancana's murder, contain redactions so extensive that intelligence law experts who have reviewed them publicly stated the blacked-out material almost certainly involves national security classifications. Not organized crime classifications, national security. That distinction matters enormously. Organized crime classifications protect ongoing investigations. They expire. They get released eventually. National security classifications are different. They protect information that governments have decided the public should never fully access. They can be renewed indefinitely. They can follow a file for 100 years. Frank Sinatra has been dead since 1998. Significant portions of his FBI file remain classified to this day. Why does a singer need a national security classification on his federal file 26 years after his death? And then there are the handwritten notes. Researchers who examined Robert Maheu's personal papers after his 2008 death confirmed the existence of the notes referencing the initial F. That confirmation appeared in a 2013 investigative piece by journalist Denton Cole, who spent 4 years attempting to identify the third party in those meetings. Cole submitted Freedom of Information requests to the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA. The CIA responded that relevant documents were exempt from disclosure. The FBI acknowledged the existence of related files and declined to release them. The NSA did not respond at all. Denton Cole died of a heart attack in 2016 before his full investigation was published. His research notes have not been made publicly available by his estate. So here is where we land. A man connected to the mob at the highest levels. A federal file with national security classifications that should not exist. A murdered witness. A silenced investigation. A set of handwritten notes with a single initial that points somewhere no official body will confirm. And 6 weeks of unexplained silence from the most famous entertainer on earth. Immediately after his closest mob contact was executed in a basement the night before he was going to tell the Senate everything he knew. Was Frank Sinatra simply a man who loved dangerous company and paid a private emotional price for it? Or was he something more operational than that? A conduit, a fixer, a man whose fame made him the perfect invisible bridge between the American government and the American underworld. The FBI knows more than it has released. The CIA almost certainly knows more than that. And the one man who could have answered every question, who lived inside every layer of this story simultaneously, chose to take it all with him. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, in a Los Angeles hospital. His last words, according to his wife Barbara, were, "I'm losing." We still don't know exactly what he meant, and we may never know what he was afraid of losing, or what he had already spent a lifetime making disappear. The full truth about Frank Sinatra may never be known, but the evidence we do have suggests that the man America loved most was living a story far darker than any song he ever sang. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell. Hundreds more stories just like this one are waiting for you.